Kennedy is great for a lot of reasons, but one of the primary reasons is his ability to paint a portrait of place, a magical place like Saratoga Springs. Saratoga is truly the nexus of New York history when you think about it. It's where Tammany came to make deals. It's where O'Connell ran the Albany gaming. It's where gangsters like Arnold Rothstein managed a criminal empire. It's also where swells like the Whitneys and the Travers came to do business and rub elbows with some of those same gangsters. It's a place that, it's a rare place where the princes of every kingdom came together to rub elbows and enabled the other two kingdoms of princes to do what they do best. Saratoga Springs is the nexus of New York history. And get ready for a treat because Bill Kennedy, one of the most remarkable and magical writers of our time, is about to take you and transport you back into that bastion of magic.
I don't know as I can live up to that introduction. Susan.
It's your turn.
I've been coming to Saratoga since I was that big, and before I was that big, because I came here when I was only a twinkle in my father's eye. And my mother had a camp on Saratoga Lake with her family, and my father came up all the time. And then after I was born, we came through here and went to the lake, and we boated, we fished. I went up to Lake George and Schroon Lake and Chestertown and so on. The Adirondacks were my summer home. And ever since, I've been coming back here with a great fervor. And when I got into the newspaper business, I wanted to come to the track because the people I loved in the newspaper business, Red Smith and Damon Runyon and a lot of other people, had written about Saratoga so fancifully and romantically and funny and crazy and all about the gamblers and the dolls and the guys and so on. It stuck in my head, and I kept coming back to reimagine whatever was happening in Albany with my stories. I brought Saratoga somewhere into it usually, and I did it specifically in this book, Quinn's book, which I wrote after Ironweed. This was took Danny Quinn back to his grandfather, and he's 10 years old in Ironweed, but here he's the narrator, and I want to read a couple of pages from the opening day of the racetrack. And it's August the 3rd, 1864. And we're going to start talking, we are going to start talking about John Morrissey, just as a way of jumping into history. And he's the fellow who brought gambling in a big way to Saratoga. He's the guy who built this room, maybe not this room, but but I think Richard Canfield had the designer redo it, and he's in here. Oh, I'll jump in and we can go from there. It's 1864, and he's the man who has brought not only gambling in the. This wasn't here in 1864. This doesn't open until 1870, but the track was opened last year, 1863, and it was such a success that they moved across the street to a bigger track. I think the first track was somewhere where the Oklahoma track is now. But this takes place on a front porch of the United States Hotel, or one of the big hotels in Saratoga where everybody who is anybody stays. And the narrator is Daniel Quinn. It's his story, and he's with his lady friend who he wants to marry. love of his life that he's known since they were teenagers together. And he saved her life, pulled her out of the freezing river. And, and now she's about to marry somebody else, or she's going with somebody else, a fellow named Gordon. And they don't get along, but that doesn't really get into this. Our triumvirate, these three people, at this point descends the porch stairs and, settling into Gordon's handsome landau drawn by a pair of matched grays, recedes now necessarily into the moving mosaic that Saratoga has become at this hour. The landau moves in a line half a mile long, extending from the front of the hotel on Broadway out past the elms on Union Avenue and onto the grounds of the new Saratoga track. The carriages are a study in aspiration, achievement, failed dreams, industrial art, social excess, taste-making, advance in retrograde design, cherished fantasy, inept pretension, and more. They are the American motley, and they carry the motley-minded denizens of a nation at war and at play. Quinn, aware that the Union Army uses up to 500 horses each day of the war, is uncomfortably gleeful to be a part of this many-horsed motley. In his woeful solitude, he embraces the crowd, famished for significance that has not been sanctified by blood. Before the day and the night are over, Quinn will observe, speak with, or become friend of, among others en route to the track, the following: Price McGrady, John the Brawn McGee, that's the name of my character in this novel, a surrogate of John Morrissey, different but the same. John the Brawn McGee's gambling partner in New York City. McGrady was a faro dealer, a gambling game of such renown that John pays him $4,500 a month plus 15% of the house winnings at all faro tables, and who is now in a fringe-top surrey alongside his lady for today, ready for his horse, Tipperary bird catcher, to win the principal race of the day. John the Brawn McGee and John Morrissey both came from Tipperary, as did my family. The Wilmot Bayards of Fifth Avenue, he a horseman and yachtsman, investor in the racetrack with John McGee, and owner of Barrister, a horse that will run in the feature race. Bayard, today among the most effulgent presences in the parade, is riding in a barouche made in France, drawn by 8 horses, and monitored by a pair of outriders who are wearing the silks of the Bayard stable, gold and green, the colors of money. Lord Cecil Glastonbury of Ottawa, the iron magnate and sympathizer with the Confederacy, is in a wine-colored 4-passenger brougham. He is the owner of Royal Traveller, the horse favored in today's feature race. Jim Fisk, the stock speculator and financial brigand, is in a 6-passenger closed coach, the largest vehicle in the line, apart from certain omnibuses owned by the hotels, in which the brigand carries 5 cuddlesome women, all 6 drawn by 6 horses that follow behind the German marching band that Fisk has hired to travel with him for the week. Colonel Wally Standish of the 104th Regulars, who rides alone in his 2-wheeled cabriolet, proving that the wound he earned in the Second Manassas campaign may have left him with a malfunctional left arm, but that his right arm is still powerful enough to control his spirited sorrel mare. And Magdalena Colon and Obadiah Griswold, Obadiah, the carriage maker and principal partner of John the Brawn McGee in establishing this racetrack, and for whom the feature race of the day, the Griswold Stakes, has been named. This notable pair, Magdalena Colon and Obadiah, are riding in Magdalena's demi-landau with its leather top folded down, she holding the reins of what is known to be the most expensive 2-passenger vehicle in Saratoga. and it is Obadiah's masterpiece, no doubt. Gilded rococo in decor, doors of polished ebony with Magdalena's initials inlaid in white Italian marble on each door. And she is in a summer dress of gray foulard silk with blue velvet buttons, the dress created in the postillon body design with tripartite tail, the new fashion favored by young women with slender figures. Along with these, in assorted buggies, phaetons, chaises, coupes, and chariots, come bankers, soldiers, politicians, Kansas farmers and Boston lawyers, literateurs from Philadelphia and actors from Albany, reprobates with dyed locks, and widows so tightly laced that breathing does not come easy. Young women with tapering arms and pouting lips, full of anxiety over the adequacy of their boteries and chausseries. Gouty sinners and flirtatious deacons, portly women with matching daughters who are starting their day as usual, full of high hope that they will today meet the significant stranger with whom the hymeneal sacrifice may at last be offered up. These and 5,000 more of their uncategorizable kind all move forward at inch-pace progress into the brightest of bright noondays beneath the sun-swept heavenly promise of life at Saratoga. That's not the end.
Where does John Morrissey fit into this scheme? And does he drive a Landau too?
Morrissey is a strange bird. He starts in Tipperary, born there, and his family comes over very soon after he's born, and they settle in Troy.
He was a tough guy, bare-knuckle brawler.
And John grows up in Troy, and he's a street kid in days of toughness of the Irish. He's right across the street from the Cut, across the river from the Cut, which was the toughest thing in America probably, was the final way into the Hudson River, a string of bar rooms, and it was worth this was in Watervliet on the west side of the Hudson, and what's called the Cut was the west side of the canal, and over the river was Troy, and this was an Irish area, and so was Troy, very largely Irish, and he grows up there as a street kid fighting. He gets into gangs. He works in a brothel as a bouncer, and he grows up, works at odd jobs, becomes involved with some politicians, and begins to see the value of that, and makes his way to New York. And in New York he becomes associated with Tammany Hall, which has put a high value on fists of young men like John McGee, John Morrissey.
On him.
They hire him to discourage Republican voters on election day.
So this has nothing to do with boxing.
And or any other voters who are not Democratic and endorsed by Tammany. And this toughness is matched in New York by equivalent fists. Among them, the group headed by a very famous fellow called Bill the Butcher Poole, who was a nativist, and giving allegiance to the Protestant ethic as it was practiced in the streets of New York on the 5 points. And it was he was Bill the Butcher for a good reason. He was a butcher and he carried a knife. And he was one of the toughest men on earth. And Marty Scorsese made a movie, Gangs of New York, in which he was a featured player. But Bill the Butcher, Bill Poole, and John Morrissey eventually come to swords points or knife points or whatever, and also fists, and they fight, and Morrissey gets beaten up. Morrissey is in a fight, not with Poole, but with someone else, and he's getting badly beaten in a saloon, and he's knocked down, and he falls onto a stove that's full of fire, and his back is severely burned. He is very seriously injured with this fiery stove, but he gets up and he fights and he wins the fight. And from then on, he became known as Old Smoke. And he was smoking.
Ouch.
Ready. And it followed him all his life. And you still see it used everywhere with his name. And the feud begins. And the stories, as they're told by historians of that era and of Morrissey himself, you can't believe the violence and the kind of fighting, the grasp, gouging out the eyes. He had one eye gouged out in one of his fights, and some doctor put it back in, or somebody put it back in and sewed him up, and he could see fine. But so many of them have their eyes plucked out and thrown away, and they do not see so fine. But the violence is very unreal. Anyway, Morrissey makes a lot of money in New York, but he wants more, and he decides to go west, and he goes to San Francisco and into California for the gold rush, and he finds no gold, but he becomes a bare-knuckle fighter out there. He gets into that, and he also discovers gambling, and he learns about Faro. Faro is a card game where you bet on any number of the cards, and the dealer turns them over. It's a very fast game, and the potential for thievery in it is enormous. By the 40s in this country, there were no more Faro banks. It was too easy to cheat. No gambling houses would use it. But you can cheat at anything, and I'd like to tell some stories about that later. But anyway, he comes back to New York. I want to get back to here, and he comes back to New York with Faro in mind, and then he goes seriously to work for Tammany during some elections, and he's so valuable to them that they give him a Faro bank, and they finance him, and he opens it up, and then he opens up another one, and before long he has 16 Faro banks up and down New York City, from the lowest class of roustabouts to the highest level of Fifth Avenue millionaires who patronize his Faro houses, his gambling houses. And it is this experience that, he gets very wealthy, and he hobnobs now with people who come to Saratoga, which of course has been here long before John Morrissey. He comes to Saratoga in 1861, but there was racing and there was gambling here since the 1830s, and county fairs and such things, and low-level gambling houses. But John brought something else to it, and when he came in 1861, he brought with him a cachet of someone who was able to function in an elite society, as well as the low society. And so this was the beginning of Saratoga.
He could transcend the circle, but he wasn't a part of this society.
No, he never became a part of the society. I mean, he did. I mean, he was a one-third owner of the track. And there were people like William Travers and eventually some the wealthiest people in the country who became partners with him. But he wasn't accepted socially. I mean, they all patronized this place. They all came here, and everybody came. When he opened this in 1870, and this was a revelation. It was like nothing in America before, and it was so posh and there was no Saratogians could participate, no women. Women could come in and have ices over in the corner, but they couldn't gamble. If they liked, they might send their husbands in or their boyfriends in to put on the roulette table or something, but $20, whatever. But they couldn't bet themselves, and it was. And he was rigid about this, and so was Richard Canfield, who came after him. But this was an original thing, and it turned Saratoga around in a way that it became even more of a mecca than what it was in the earlier years, and it was enormous in the earlier years. I mean, Henry James was here. This was 1870, about that time, and James didn't like Saratoga. He was of all the elitist novelists of America, I think James is at the pinnacle. And he
hung out with Edith Wharton.
What?
He hung out with Edith Wharton.
Yes, and he also preferred Newport and Monaco on the Riviera to Saratoga. He was very acidulous in his essay. He wrote an essay in 1870 about Saratoga that was very, very insulting, but a lot of it was very true. And I mean, this town was unbelievable. Everybody came here. I mean, I wished I had it. I thought I had it, but his vision of the women and how the women would change their clothes 5-6 times a day and parade themselves. It was like the mothers had their daughters. It was like a slave market, and they're looking for husbands instead of buyers. Buyers, the same thing. Anyway, we can go on from there. But Saratoga had a cachet that was wonderful, and it had a very elite population, but it also had this raffish influx during the season. And
when did the Gangsters start to really move in?
Well, in a sense, it comes with it comes after Canfield. Canfield follows John Morrissey. Canfield comes in and he enhances this place and makes it even more upscale, and puts in a French chef, and he loses $70,000 a year during the month of August on running this. And this is in 1885, 86. And when he's running this place, I'm off on the dates. When he's running this place, it becomes grander, and as a gambling place, richer and more adventurous than any other place in the country. I mean, he just upped the betting levels on his own, and then the very wealthy asked him, can we raise them higher? And he said yes. And he had a safe built in this house, in this building somewhere. He kept millions in the safe. So he could not be outbid on a hand of cards.
And this is a guy who has casinos on Park Avenue in New
Right,
York City.
right. He was very big in New York, and he came in after a terrible episode in the time. We were talking about Nellie Bly.
Sure, a journalist.
And Nellie Bly came up here in 1894, and she found out that this track that was running here was run by a man named Gottfried Waldbaum. And Nellie Bly wrote a piece that said, "Our wickedest resort, Saratoga." And here she went out to the racetrack and she found women very casual about everything. Sex. Betting they had a betting room for women. Children 8 and 10 years old behind her were talking about the horses, and they were betting dollars and 50 cents or whatever. I don't know how they were doing it, but children and women were betting, and it was scandalous. Or at least Nellie Bly made it scandalous, and had a vision of Saratoga that was dynamite. And in 1894, there was a fellow named Caleb Mitchell who was the president of Saratoga. Saratoga was a village and it had a president.
Not a mayor.
Not a mayor, no. And he had a gambling house across the street from one of the big hotels, and he was letting the track run wild under Waldbaum. And that was part of the expose as well. And Mitchell was thrown out of office the following year, and somebody else was put in, and they closed down the city for gambling for a little bit, but they opened it the following year, and that was when Canfield came in and took over and enhanced everything. It was, but the mayor, Caleb Mitchell, was so put off by, he could not open his own gambling house. After they closed him down, he couldn't open his gambling house again. And he sued, he had Canfield as his enemy, and there was a senator named Brackett who was from Saratoga, and a state senator.
State senator in Albany, right?
And he had passed a couple of laws which first got rid of Caleb Mitchell out as a trustee, as the mayor, the president, and then he got rid of Mitchell's weapon again, trying to bring charges against the people who were running gambling and who were controlling it, and among them was Canfield. And he couldn't. He lost and he lost. And then finally, years passed. I mean, in 1902, Mitchell is at his wit's end, and he goes and he buys a gun. And he buys some bullets, and then he goes to wherever, in City Hall, the City Hall in Saratoga, and goes to Senator Brackett's office. Senator Brackett turned out not to be in his office that day. And so obviously Caleb Mitchell was truly at his wit's end, and so instead of killing the senator, he killed himself, shot himself right on the doorway of the senator's office.
An abrupt end to the presidency.
That was the end of the Mitchell era of gambling.
So this is at the turn of the century. This is in New York City. There's a tremendous influx of immigrants from Ireland, Eastern Europe, and they're all mixing on the Lower East Side and at 5 Points. And somehow they trickle up the Hudson And a few special people end up in Saratoga, like Arnold Rothstein.
Well, Arnold Rothstein he was a special case. I mean, he was the brain. He was the fixer.
That's what they called him, right? The brain.
Brilliant character, and he came up to Saratoga very belatedly. I mean, he was here, like he was married in Saratoga to a showgirl. I mean, something magical happened to him up here, and he married this woman, and then he kept coming back over and over again, and eventually he came up, and after a close down of the gambling again, he came into it, and he opened up a place called
The Brook?
The Brook, yeah. I'm hearing a whistle. Am I getting it? Am I in my...
It's just in your head.
I don't usually hear whistling in my head. I usually hear singing in my head. I channel Mitch Miller. But
they're fixing it, I think.
he opened the Brook, and it was like Canfield to the second power, and out of town, not here, and it was very elite, and he ran it for a long time. But then they kept closing and closing. But what Rothstein did was he brought in two of the most significant people who came to town here. When that was Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano. And they were just young bucks working with Lansky, but eventually they became powerhouses up here, and they owned several of the casinos. Somebody said they owned them all, but I don't think they ever owned them all. They may have had money in them all, but they owned the Arrowhead, they owned Piping Rock, they owned the Chicago Club. Luciano had that. That was the only one that was downtown. What?
Stables too, right? They owned horses and stables.
They may have, but they played a low profile. They weren't seen around here a whole lot. I mean, they were here, obviously, but they weren't here a whole lot. But they were very powerful. And Joe Adonis was another figure, and there was the whole cabal of the Italian mob was somehow in power. Frank Costello was another one who was up here. And Costello was also connected to Albany with very low profile in Albany, but he was, I think, supplying slot machines. He was the slot machine king in the 30s, and I think that he was doing business in Albany as well.
Did Albany's political machine, I mean, they must have had some influence on what happened in Saratoga.
Yeah, the Albany political machine was definitely involved up here, especially in one place called Smith's Interlaking. And there was a very famous Albany gambler who a person in the audience I know very well knows who I'm talking about. His name was Scotchy Morrison. And I'm talking about Jack McEnany over here, our current assemblyman about to retire, and an old pal of mine. And but I want to read about the Albany connection here. This involves my uncle. My uncle was a guy named Pete McDonald, is my mother's brother, and
was he a dealer?
he was a dealer. He was everything. He was a hustler, a pool hustler. He was a pool hustler, and I made him the principal figure in this novel that I wrote, my third novel, Billy Phelan's Greatest Game. And here's how the Albany connection worked with Saratoga. Billy was in Saratoga that year because one night a month earlier he was hanging around Broadway in Albany when Bindi McCall came by. Bindi, in a tan fedora with a flower pot crown, had connections and investments in Saratoga gambling, a natural byproduct of his control of all the action in Albany, all of it. Gambling houses, horse rooms, policy, clearinghouse, card games, one-armed bandits, punch boards. Playing games in Albany meant you first got the okay from Bindi. Billy touched Bindi's elbow that night. "Hey, Billy, you got a second, Ben? I need some work. Can you fix me up for Saratoga next month?" "What can you do?" "Anything." "Anything at all?" "Craps, poker, blackjack, roulette. I can deal, handle a stick." "How good are you?" "Haven't you heard?" Billy said. Bindi chuckled. "I'll ask around someone who has. See Lemon Lewis." "All right, Bindi, fine. Obliged. Can I touch you for 50? Bindi chuckled again. Billy's got brass. Bindi reached for the roll and plucked a 50 out of the middle. "Use it in good health." "Never felt better," said Billy. "I pay my debts." Billy saw, "I know you do. I heard that about you." Billy saw Lewis an hour later at the bar in Becker's, and he got the word, "You deal at Riley's." Billy was the youngest dealer in town that year in Saratoga, and he was doing fine for 2 weeks, and then Paul Whiteman came to his table. Billy knew who Whiteman was when the big boy rolled the dice and lost the last of his wad. "Let's have 500 in chips, Sonny, and an IOU," Whiteman said. "Who the hell are you?" "I don't know you," Billy said. "Sonny me, you son of a bitch." Hubie Malloy, the crazy, was at the table that night. He was from Albany, always carried a gun, but Billy liked him. Hubie smiled when Whiteman called Billy Sonny. Big timer, throwing his weight around, that big gut, and he figures out everybody on earth knows his mustache. "I'm Paul Whiteman." "Wyman?" Whiteman. "Oh, yeah, Whiteman. You're the guy that's got that hillbilly band playing over at Piping Rock." "You don't mean nothing to me, bud. Go see the manager if you want chips." They fired Billy 20 minutes later. Orders from above, from those who didn't want to make enemies of Paul the man. Lemon Lewis came over to the table and said, "I hate to do it, Billy, but we got to can you. I'll call over to Newman's in the Chicago club, see what they got going." And Billy went from Riley's to the Chicago club on earlier hours. The Cub got a big play in the afternoon, even though the horses were running at the track. Was Billy lucky? He certainly was. Angie Velas saw him dealing at the Chicago club, and when he took a break, she asked him for a light. "You weren't out of work long," she said. "Who told you I was out of work?" "I was there when you gave it to Whiteman. Funniest damn thing I heard in years." Imagine anybody saying that to Paul Whiteman. "You're the one with the hillbilly band." I laughed right out loud. Whiteman gave me an awful dirty look. By that time, Billy was playing kneesies with Angie.
It seems like there's only so much that some politicians can take of all of this, and they occasionally make noises like they want to shut it down. Al Smith.
There was always this push by the reformers over the years, the shutdown. After there was the push before Nellie Bly, and then it got very big, and then that was in the 90s. And then in the teens, it started about 1906, and they closed down again in a couple of years. And then when Charles Evans Hughes was governor, he kept a promise that he would close down gambling in the state, and he closed down Saratoga in the years 1910 and 11. And by that time, he was already gone when he was an associate justice in the Supreme Court. But Saratoga was closed. But it only lasted. In 1912, they opened up again. This always happened. And there was I remember when they stopped bookies at the track, they closed down the track. And they had, the law said you could not write on a slate your betting odds and so on like that. And I knew a fellow named Swifty Meade who was up here. He was a bookie, and he was a gambler in Albany and very, very much involved with politics. It was inseparable in Albany. And that whole close down was just temporary. They found, when Saratoga began to fail in the summer because nobody wanted to go to the track, you couldn't bet. You had to bet at the hotel room and then get paid off the next day at the hotel room. You couldn't bet at the track. So they found a loophole, so you couldn't write anything on a slate, but you could say the bets orally. So bookies began to speak their odds, and I remember Swifty told me that he bet a horse that was like 15 to 1, and it won. And then the odds kept changing, as things happen. Obviously, on the tote boards today, you get fluctuating odds, and it's the same with the bookies, and they would orally change it. But Swifty, when he went to get paid off, the bookie said, "No, when you bet it, the odds were 8 to 1, not 15 to 1." and so he sort of appealed to the next highest court, whatever it was in those days, and he won. He got paid off at 15 to 1. So it was a very strange thing. Anyway, so.
Should we take some questions?
Yeah, let's take some questions. I don't know. Nobody has any questions. Yes.
One.
Saratoga?
Yeah, any stories about, you went to the auction before one of the casinos and they auctioned everything off, right?
Pardon?
The auction for one of the casinos.
Oh, yeah.
Stuff like that, your personal memories, and then you can do with Saratoga.
Oh, well.
Your own personal seedy side of Saratoga.
Get it?
Your own personal remembrances of the seedy side of Saratoga.
The seedy side.
Let's get salacious.
Well, I remember I covered the closing of Piping Rock when I was working for the Times Union. I just came up and decided I wanted to do a story. And I was very saddened by it. I remember that. And I don't know why. I mean, it was, I'd been there once or twice and with my parents when I was a kid. I don't know who we saw, maybe Sophie Tucker or somebody like that, Jimmy Durante. And I remember they had that big tray where they put like half a cow and wheeled it around to your table and sliced that extremely rare roast beef and had that great silver cover on it. It was wonderful. I almost bought that. But I remember I got a tour of the place, and there was a side door where these watchers, these people who were paid by the casino, could come in secretly and not walk through the club or disturb the play, and they would be able to climb up to the second floor and then look down on the card tables and the crap tables, and you had a total vision of anybody. And of course, this was to stop people from cheating. And you would see people hiding cards or marking cards or what, or doing who knows what. There's all kinds of ways to cheat. And oh, and I found some IOUs. I still have them somewhere in the house.
Keep them.
Some little slips of IOU, $10,000.
Where was the piping rod?
They weren't filled in.
What did it mean if they were folded?
You know, one of the speaking about cheating, one of the fellows I knew, when I was writing a book about Legs Diamond, I came across a guy who I'll call Jack, and he was from Mechanicville. Somebody told me he was the best card dealer they had ever seen, and so I went up to talk to him. He knew Jack Diamond. He knew Luciano. He used to work in the Chicago club for a while. He was a specialist at marked cards. And he said once they found somebody they thought had brought in a marked deck. How he brought it in, they didn't know, but it was in. And he went up and he found a mark on one of the cards. It took him 2 hours, he said, but he found it. But he showed me some marked decks that he used to use. He started off when he was a kid at 12 years old learning how to play cards. And he studied with a magician. And the magician told him a lot of card tricks and how to, make cards disappear. And then he started, he went eventually to work on ocean liners and on the trains. There was always a card game on the trains, on the ocean liners, and the card hustlers were always there. And he showed me that he could shuffle, he just took a deck of cards and he just cut it in half and then shuffled it, that way, and then held it up. It was a brand new deck, and not a card had moved. It was still 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. He had shuffled it 2 or 3 times. And then he shuffled it this way and showed it, and not a card had moved. And then he showed me the way the cards were marked. And cards have this kind of complex designs on them, little, crisscrosses and all kinds of designs of triangles and flowers and whatever. But in this particular card, many of the cards were just totally even across the top, except one he picked out for me. It had a little triangle that you could see up in the far corner, very small, tiny thing, but it was visible on the card if you're close to it. And that was a card that was 10, Jack, King, or Queen. And then there was a card with a little triangle in the middle. And it was unobtrusive. You didn't see it, but there it was in the middle. And that was like the 6, 7, and 8. And then the one on the left was for the low numbers. And he said, what?
Was it in a pencil or a
No, no. It was built into the design. These cards are created. They were designed this way by the card makers. I mean, these cards are made as fraudulent decks.
I see.
And you could go and buy them, or you could have them made in your own way. And he did that. He used to buy them by the gross, and then create his own decks. So he would. He showed me how he did it, and he dealt a hand of black. This deck was only used for blackjack, and he said that he had been asked, by the way, after a particular big coup he had made here in Saratoga, probably by Luciano. he was asked if he wanted to go to work for the mob. And he said, no, I never did. He said, I was always very straight.
Everything is relative.
Yeah, he always liked to play cards at the Elks Club. He only stole from Elks. Anyway, he dealt me 6 hands of blackjack across the table, and I'm watching him. And he said, I can do anything. He said, I can deal seconds, I can deal from the bottom. He said, I keep the cards on the top what I want, wherever I want them. And he dealt himself 6 times in a row, 20. 6 times in a row, 2 picture cards. Or 10s or whatever they were. And
Do you
I
still
didn't,
have
I needless to say, never got a 20 or a blackjack.
Do you still have the deck?
Oh, I don't have the deck. No, that was Jack's. I couldn't handle it, but
That's too bad.
yeah. But he said there were 2 cheaters, the 2 guys who weren't cheaters, and one was called Big Nickel and the other one was called Little Nickel, and they were card counters, and they could tell you in a 5-card stud game, after 3 cards, what your whole card was, every time. I said, can you do that? He said, no, I never had to. One more story on Jack. He was working as a bartender in a speakeasy, and it was near the 7 Furlong Chute, whatever that was. Was there such a place? Does anybody ever remember a saloon or a speakeasy called the 7 Furlong Chute? There undoubtedly was a 7 Furlong Chute at the track. But there was a speakeasy near it anyway, and this is somewhere in the 30s, and probably late 30s. And he was bartending, and there was a fellow named Boston Kitty. And Boston Kitty came in with 3 of his friends, and he wanted a drink, and he said to Jack, who attended the bar, he saw behind the bar was this cup dice, India dice, and you had 5 dice in the cup, and you rolled them as like poker, and Boston Kitty saw them, and he said, "Can you look like a good fella. You play those Boston dice?" And Jack said, "Yeah, sometimes." And so Kitty said, "I'll roll you for a drink for everybody in the house. How's that?" Jack said, "Okay." And so Boston Kitty took the thing, and Jack said, I could see him controlling one of the dice. He said, I saw how he did it, and he had one. He said, but what he didn't know is that I could control 2. So he just kept rolling, and the 3 guys around Boston Kitty said, "You're all done, Kitty. You're all done." And Vincent Cole, the gangster, was in the bar that night, and was a friend of Jack's actually, and Mad Dog Cole, remember him? The baby killer, and he had killed a guy in New York. And at this time, I don't think he was a fugitive. It was before he was a fugitive, and. But he was there, and he was so amused by it all that he bought a drink for the house. So, anyway, so end of question.
Who else? Over here.
What caused all casinos to finally shut down?
I can't hear that question.
What caused all the casinos to finally shut down?
Oh, that's a really interesting. What happened was, there's this impetus for years to somewhere along the line to shut them down, but everybody up here wanted them. And all through the 20s, 30s, 40s, I mean, there's a couple of shutdowns here and there, but in the 40s, down around 48, Thomas E. Dewey was governor, and he shut down some gambling in the 40s. He shut down Albany in 43 as soon as he got to be governor, and my uncle hated him. Really hated him. Dan O'Connell, who was the boss of Albany, also hated him. Hated him more than any other governor. And But I wrote a play about Dan O'Connell having a war with Dewey. But that was, it was all political. What happened was the Kefauver Committee comes along in 1951. Estes Kefauver, who's a gambler, and is gambling all over the place and is well known. And he decides to go and expose the mafia. And he has all these mafiosi come and testify before his Senate subcommittee and a Senate committee on gambling in America. And among them was a very famous Frank Costello, who resisted being shown on camera. And so they only showed Costello's hands during the testimony. And you kept seeing him doing this and this and this, whatever. And and Dewey was summoned also. This was a Democratic committee, chaired by Kefauver, a Democrat. And Dewey would not go. He refused to do it. And they came and they asked, some of their investigators asked the head of the state police, I think it was a guy named Gaffney, and the question to him was, how come, with all the laws against gambling in this state, that Saratoga casinos are allowed to run wide open? And Chief Gaffney, whatever his title was, he said, well, that's not my responsibility. He was the head of all the police, and if it wasn't his, who was it? It was very embarrassing to Dewey. But he refused. He sent somebody to send a statement about gambling, and he was very shocked to find out that there was gambling in Saratoga. And then he impaneled a whole investigative committee to attack Saratoga. And they came up here and they indicted 42 people, including Jim Leary, who was the head of the Republican Party up here and who was the boss of politics for 20, 30 years, whatever. And also Doc Leonard, who was the Democratic, who was the Commissioner of Public Safety for 22 years. He was twice defeated in and out, and then twice resigned, but he always came back. And I think Leary and Leonard were both indicted. I don't think either one of them were convicted. I know Leary wasn't. Leary was a top lawyer. I mean, he was a tough lawyer, and he had a cadre of lawyers that were superior. A fellow named Jim Carroll and Bill Ford and Mike Sweeney, and if anybody knows the Albany law history, the great lawyer in Albany was Dan Pryor, and he represented a lot of major people who didn't think they were going to get acquitted, but did. And among them was Legs Nyman. He was Legs Nyman's lawyer. He was a great criminal lawyer. And Leary and Pryor were on a par. And also they talked about Leary being, Carroll being on a par with Stuart Jones in Troy. Stuart, not the current one, but the previous one, the father. And he was this was how the gambling was permitted. It was paid for to the politicians, to Leary and to Doc Leonard. And Leary got a payoff of $60,000 from one casino owner who wanted to start in business. And that was just a start. And the casinos made zillions and zillions of dollars. And I interviewed Bill Ford one day, and I asked him, I said, how can you figure out how much was paid off to the, to let the casinos run? How much were the politicians paid? He said, that is not reachable. And it wasn't, and it never has been, and I don't know. The New York Daily News said that it was $1,000 a day to the politicians. That meant 1,000 to Jim Leary and 1,000 to Doc Leonard. But somebody else said to me that was nowhere near enough. There was a lot bigger payoff than that. And I mean, when Leary died, he left a fortune of $7 million somewhere in the 60s. And I think it was the 60s, I'm not sure. But whenever it was, he left it to his daughter. But anyway, Dewey came in, and to avoid embarrassment at the hands of the Fall River Committee, he began his own investigation of his own turf. And so he closed down everything in Saratoga. And that was the end of gambling in Saratoga, the end of the casinos. And Dewey did it. Lansky was up here at that time. So Frank Costello was here. Luciano was here. Luciano had been in, it was 1951, yeah. No, Luciano wasn't here. He was in jail, he was gone. Luciano was gone in the 40s. Luciano's a great story too, in Saratoga and the whole area. He was in Denimora, and then they brought him down to Comstock, and he used to get visits from his fellow gangsters. But Dewey was the evil genius behind closing down Saratoga, and he did it, and we'll never forgive him. Especially my uncle.
I think we're probably about out of time.
What?
I'm sorry.
I can't believe this.
I know.
Call my lawyer.
I think that this was a lot of fun. What do you think?
Susan Arbetter, thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful evening. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming tonight to the Canfield Casino and History Museum. We have some refreshments left out in the hall. Hope to see you again in a couple weeks for our next program.
You were great.